Are they leaving? Are they staying? Bible reading? Ever praying? Will the church be ever graying? Don't you see why we are saying, are the kids alright?
Welcome to Are the Kids All Right, the latest sub-series from the Holy Post. Whether you're a parent, a youth pastor, a teacher, or a young person yourself, you've probably seen all of the headlines concerning Gen Z. Rates of depression and loneliness are surging, their relationship with technology is kind of troubling, and they are leaving the church in droves. We've talked about these trends a lot on the Holy Post, but we're not alone. 10 by 10 is a new collaborative discipleship initiative whose mission is to make faith matter more for this younger generation. You'll hear more about the great work they're doing later in the show, but we've partnered with 10 by 10 to create this series and to hear from experts in each episode about the challenges young people and those who care about them are facing. One of those experts is Lisa Damour. Lisa is an American clinical psychologist and New York Times best-selling author who specializes in the development of teenagers and young people. Her newest book, The Emotional Lives of Teenagers, helps us understand teenagers' intense and often fraught emotional lives and how to support them through this critical developmental stage. Kaitlyn Schiess sat down with Lisa to find out if the kids are going to be all right.
Thank you, Dr. Damour, for joining us today. I'm so excited to get to talk to you about, I just spent the last few days finishing reading your book, The Emotional Lives of Teenagers, and reading a lot of your recent articles. And I just am excited for what people will learn from you about what can kind of be a scary topic for a lot of people. So thank you for being here.
I'm honored to be here and really glad that we're thinking about this together.
So one of the central themes of your book, The Emotional Lives of Teenagers, is that we treat intense negative emotions, kind of just generally, not just with teenagers, as something to be avoided. And a lot of the questions you get asked, I liked the stories in the book where, someone says, my kid is having a hard time because we're doing a big move before their senior year of high school. And I did that as a teenager. And I thought, of course, they're having a hard time. That's horrible, But I remember, and I experienced this with, people my age and older now who are parents thinking, I want to protect my kid. And even for myself, I want to avoid difficult emotions. My assumption is that that's not a state we're supposed to be in, and so I should avoid it. And you describe in the book that you think this is somewhat of a cultural shift, that our approach to this has changed over time. So can you talk to us a little bit about this dynamic? How have we ended up thinking that negative emotions are something to be avoided or something that normal, healthy people shouldn't be experiencing?
I think there's a few forces at work. As much as I'm a huge fan of wellness, I do have some questions about the commercialization of wellness. There's a lot of money caught up in selling the idea that you're supposed to feel good or calm or relaxed. And there's, if you don't, there's measures you can take to make that happen. There's value in wellness. It helps us maintain our emotional equilibrium. But I worry, and I'm not someone who's prone to worry, that it sort of created a condition where people feel like if you don't feel at ease and calm and relaxed, something's really wrong, as opposed to you're having a feeling that may not be a pleasant feeling. So I think there's that. I think the pandemic was just horrible and really rocked people, and I think there's a very strong wish to get past that completely and not feel bad again like we felt bad through that. So there's various forces at work. I will say, now, as we talk about the adolescent mental health crisis, which I'm so glad we're talking about, and it gets so much coverage in the media, there are some complexities to how it gets covered. And one of the things that I notice is that so often in the headlines, psychological distress is equated with mental health concern. You'll see the two rolled up together. And of course, that's not true, right? Like, you moved as a rising high school senior, that was evidence of your mental health, that you were like, what? This isn't good, right? Like, psychological distress is just part of life. It can get out of hand and then needs to be addressed very carefully. But most of the time, it's just, a feeling like any other, and it's telling us what's happening. And so I think, though, I have so much empathy for families raising teenagers right now. Everybody's been through so much. The headlines are pretty harrowing. And I really understand it if a parent or a caregiver or somebody who, is responsible for a teenager looks at a kid who's having a very bad day and having a very negative, intense emotion, as teenagers sometimes do, and gets scared, because there are so many headlines that are telling us so many scary things about what's happening for teenagers, and it's not always easy to know when to worry and when it's sort of typical and expectable.
That's so helpful. Yeah, I mean, I feel like even in my church context, and one of my best friends is a youth pastor, and she's fielding all the time parents who, for very understandable reasons, are worried and don't know what kind of is normal and what isn't. Talk to us a little bit about kind of on a broader scale, besides, individual kids, obviously there's so many specific things going on, but it feels like on one hand, as you've just described, we're hypersensitive to kind of the emotional distress, especially of teenagers. On the other hand, it seems like things are objectively really different now, whether that's COVID, whether that's internet culture. Help us sort out, are kids worse off now? Are they more anxious, depressed, isolated, or are we more concerned about, is it a combination of those things?
It's a really important question. The short answer is yes, actually. It is, we do see rising rates of depression and anxiety in teenagers, and those predate the pandemic. Mm-hmm. And we have a range of explanations for that. The pressures on teenagers are quite a bit different now than they were when we were teenagers, both in terms of our achievement pressures, really across the socioeconomic spectrum. We also have kids metabolizing a huge amount of information that, I'm 52. When I was a teenager, the day shut down when I walked in the door, and I, of course, wanted to be running around with my friends all the time, but, it was good, I think, in retrospect, that things quieted as they did. So teenagers are, I think there's a lot of demands on their output, and there's a lot of demands on their input, that they're, social media is a complicated player in this. It's not a simple answer or explanation, but kids are in constant touch with one another. They are constantly aware of the headlines about, distressing news in the world in a way that has not been accessible to previous generations. One explainer that I think is important to think through is we also see that teenagers sleep quite a bit less than they used to. And the graph of worsening sleep in teenagers maps almost perfectly on the graph for worsening mental health in teenagers. And so when I think, beyond the broad strokes, if I think about a particular kid, and there's a good chance that particular teenager's not sleeping as much as they should, and by should, we mean 9 hours of sleep a night, which is way more than most teenagers get.
Yeah.
I think that the adults around that kid can think, okay, well, what's getting in the way of this kid's sleep? Is it that they've got their phone in their room and they're up all night on it? Is it that they've got 4 AP classes and they're not able to get enough sleep? Is it that they're working 2 jobs to try to support their family? So for me, sleep can become a very useful entry point into trying to make sense of what may be happening for any one young person. So I think there is a reality that things are harder and that we need to look carefully for kid by kid about what to do. The other thing that we don't want to lose sight of is it has never been easy to be a teenager, and it has never been easy to raise a teenager. And I'm so grateful that I had been practicing for almost 30 years before the pandemic came along, because I've seen a lot, and I sort of feel like it wasn't all the pandemic, right? I mean, that there was plenty that is just rich and spicy around teenagers, no matter what you're doing. And so I feel like so much of my work right now is to try to articulate that development is a bumpy road, and development with teenagers has always been a bumpy road. And we may have been in a ditch for 18 months with the pandemic, but now we're just back on the bumpy road with some new bumps thrown in. And in articulating that, the other thing I'm trying to articulate is there's no smooth road. It's not like somebody can move, do the secret handshake to get us to a place where adolescence is an easy thing. It has never been like that. It's never going to be like that. And I think we want to have realistic understanding of what's involved with being a teenager and raising a teenager.
Yeah. Along those lines, I so appreciate how you have described kind of the physical, chemical changes happening in what we would consider preteens and teens' brains and what it explains. And I have to admit, even reading some of the descriptions you gave of some, especially teenage girls, because I was a teenage girl, some of the descriptions of their experiences, I was crying reading this because I remembered so strongly that feeling of, you tell a story about a girl having sort of outsized emotional responses to things and saying, I feel like I'm going crazy. Yeah. And I remember being a teenage girl and being like, I'm upset at how I am feeling. Like, my parents are upset about it, but I'm upset about it too, because I don't know where it's coming from. And before we get into some of the stuff about, how parents should think about talking to their teenagers, or how other, adults who care about them can talk to them, talk to us a little bit about what about the developing brains of teenagers do you think is most helpful for anyone who loves them to understand, and maybe get some more empathy for what's going on, or maybe just some explanation for, as you just said, some of this might be the particulars of what we're going through, and some of it might just be being a teenager is a hard thing.
It's a hard thing. So teenagers' brains go through a fairly spectacular renovation project. And it starts with puberty, and puberty starts before you can see the outward signs of it. So we're talking 10, 11, well underway for most kids by that time. And the renovation project of their brain ultimately turns their brain into a faster, more efficient, more powerful machine. Now, the thing that is unfortunate for everybody is that it's not an overall renovation all at once. It is a progressive renovation that starts in the lower order regions of the brain, closer to the back of the head, near the neck, top of the neck. And that is where the emotions are housed. And it progresses over time to the higher order regions of the brain behind the forehead. And that is where the perspective maintaining systems are housed. And so the thing that is so hard on the poor teenager and everyone around that poor teenager is that they go through a period that we kind of refer to sometimes as a gawky brain, where their emotion centers have been upgraded, are faster, more powerful, more reactive, and their perspective maintaining systems have not yet been upgraded and are comparatively weak. And what's critical to understand here is that when a teenager is calm, their brain works great. And I always bristle when people are like, teenagers, their brains aren't fully developed till they're 24. I'm like, are you kidding me? Like, look at the artwork that Junior just did. Like, are you telling me that's not a developed brain? When they're calm, they can out-reason us. They're fantastic, right? Like, there's no question. When they become upset, when they get stirred up, their emotion centers are comparatively forceful and can kind of overwhelm their systems and leave them and their, the adults around them kind of like blown away by how undone the kid becomes. And I love what you voiced about even the kid themselves is like, what is this, right? And this is where we refer in psychology, we refer to the ages 6 to 10 as latency, like all of the intense emotions of being a little kid have gone latent, and then they come back, 10, 11, 12. And the thing that's so poignant about 13-year-olds is they remember being 10 and 11 and 12 and not having meltdowns over the fact that they cannot find the genes that they're looking for. And so these poor kids are in these junctures where they're just like, I am both melting down and I cannot believe I'm melting down. And just to be sweet with them about it is critical, I think.
Yeah, it was so helpful for me to read it and go, okay, on one level, I'm familiar with this, both personally, and I'm around teenagers a lot now at church and in other, that live in my neighborhood. And I can see, this is not just you're a bad person or you're not reasoning well or you can tell that there's more going on. But it was amazing how illuminating it still was to hear, okay, these are responses that make sense for what's happening in someone's brain. Yeah. And one more thing I want to ask you about before we kind of get into some more practical questions for people. One significant chunk of this book and a much larger amount of the work that you have done has been with teenage girls specifically. And you talk in this book about how there are different gendered responses to emotional distress. Talk to us a little bit about what you have seen in those differences and maybe even, help us understand why they might exist. Yeah. Maybe they don't exist for the reasons we might think, but kind of what's going on there with, I think most people who are around teenagers see there are differences and how we respond to emotion and especially really intense emotions is different. But how could we think well about those differences?
Yeah. So the easiest way I think to describe it is to say that our culture has very clear rules about who's allowed to feel what. And these rules are transmitted to kids at very young ages. And girls are allowed to feel a whole lot more than boys are allowed to feel. And the way I think about it and the way I wrote about it is that girls enjoy this very wide emotional highway with a lot of lanes in it, right? They can be sad, they can be anxious, they can be excited, and they can actually even be angry. Like girls get plenty angry. The asterisk on that is if you're Black, it's not so safe to get angry. But we do see, that through adolescence and through childhood, girls do express anger. Boys, on the other hand, are given a 2-lane road. They are allowed to feel angry. That is a culturally sanctioned emotion for boys to have, or they're allowed to take pleasure at somebody else's expense. But any vulnerable emotion, any fearful emotion, any tender emotion, any sweet emotion, boys are quickly given the message by the culture that those are girl things. And especially boys who are working to consolidate a sense of masculinity feel that they cannot, allow themselves to outwardly express anything that is vulnerable or anxious or sad. And this comes at a cost for everybody. It's not good for the boys. It's not good for the people around the boys, because often what happens is that boys end up expressing their distress by acting out, by being hard on the people around them, by getting themselves in trouble. So this is something that we hand down in the culture, and it's something we have to work really, really deliberately against. I will say, in writing the book, something came clear to me that I hadn't really sort of thought through before working on this project, and that it's the fact that so often in family life, if there's a 2-parent mom-dad household, it's the mom who's doing the emotional work, talking about feelings, asking about feelings, checking in about how everything's going. And this is, of course, incredibly well-intentioned. This is, of course, the culture seeping right into our homes, right, where women are talking about feelings, dads are not necessarily talking about feelings. And what occurred to me while I was writing is like, oh no, right? The thing that I think may be happening is this well-meaning mom who's trying to get her son talking about feelings may be unwittingly reinforcing the exact problem she's trying to fix, which is by 4th or 5th grade, a lot of boys decide that talking about feelings, and I'm going to use finger quotes, is a girl thing to do. Mm-hmm. And then if the only person in their home who's bringing it up happens to be a woman, it doesn't help the situation. I think, it can work. I'm not saying it's never a possibility. But what became so clear to me in working on this book was that if we want boys to talk about their feelings, it's the men in their lives who need to be showing them how it's done, who need to be asking about emotions, talking about their own emotions. And we can't just treat this as women's work.
That's so important. And it gives me a good opportunity to say, before I get into some of these questions, sort of practically for people, that's such an important word for a father. It's also such an important word for any adult man who loves teenagers and has teenagers in their community, in their church. I think a lot of people listening volunteer with the youth group at their church or are involved in some way. And it's a big desire of mine in the church that I'm in, where I don't have kids, and a lot of it's increasingly true at my church that many women in particular, there's more women than men at the church, would like to have kids and do not. And so cultivating a sense that there are a bunch of adults that want to serve these kids well, want to understand well how to help them navigate these. So for people listening, before I get into these questions, I just want to say, if you're a parent, hopefully this will be really helpful for you, but also if you're just someone who loves teenagers, it benefits all of us, and it especially, I think, benefits the parents of teenagers if other people are being really conscientious about how they love those teenagers well.
Absolutely. And just to underscore that, right, we have studied teenagers for so long, and we know that the single most powerful force for mental health in teenagers is strong relationships with caring adults. We know this. Yeah. And especially with teenagers, it's not always going to be the folks at home who are filling those roles. It's the nature of adolescence that you actually want to be more autonomous. So especially with teenagers, it is the teachers, the coaches, the youth pastors, the loving neighbors, the fantastic aunt and uncle who have so much sway in this. And so when I think about the adolescent mental health crisis, I'm like, this is everybody's thing to help solve, right? Yeah. If you have a teenager in your life and you're a good grown-up, you have a part to play in helping to get us through and out of this adolescent mental health crisis.
That is such a good way to put it. you give a lot of insight for all of these people, for parents, other, caring adults in a teenager's life, for responding to emotional distress. And I found that a big theme of this, both in reading your book and in my own experience of, I have friends who are parents of teenagers and will, express their failures at responding well to emotional distress. And it seems like there's also just internal work for the adults that has to be done first to respond well. What do you most often see as a problem in adults, parents or otherwise, that causes us to respond poorly to teenage emotions? Like, are there things that we should be conscious of in ourselves, or like things we might want to work on before we're even thinking about, the problem is them, the problem is addressing what's going on with them? Could there be some problems that are us?
I think it can be really hard. And I think the way to walk up to this is, let's figure out what the target is. Like, what's the target behavior of the adult, and then what gets in the way of hitting the target? So the target adult behavior when a teenager is very upset, I can actually sum it up in 2 words. It's to try to be a steady presence. Invested, engaged, but not overreacting. Sounds really easy, actually very, very hard to do. All right, so there's a few things that can get in the way. Number 1, your own bad day, right? We all have our lives, our ups and downs, our bad nights of sleep, our worries. And if you're struggling yourself and then a teenager comes your way with a big, powerful feeling, of course it's going to be hard to be a steady presence. Yeah. I think another thing that gets in the way is that teenage emotions are unusually potent. We know this. They are more powerful than little kid emotions. They're more powerful than adult emotions. It's a lot about the neurological world that we just walked our way through. And so it's very alarming at times to be an adult facing a teenage emotion. I mean, kids have very powerful meltdowns. They get very upset. They get very angry. And it can be destabilizing to the adult who's watching it. I think another thing that I talk about a little in the book, but I actually think is a much bigger topic than gets addressed. I think especially with teenagers, it stirs up a lot of memories for adults and certainly for parents. And there's a few things at work here. One is our own adolescent emotions are very vivid. Like, we actually, like you described, like you can kind of take yourself back there, and probably more memorable than emotions we had at 5, 6, 7. So we have that. Another is that we're older when we're teenagers. We can remember more of what happened. And so I tell a story in my book, and all the stories are true, of a friend, a colleague, who, when her own daughter became a teenager and started to have some trouble around emotional eating, it mapped onto that adult's memories of struggling with her weight when she was a teenager and thinking about how her parents handled it, which was not well. They were not kind. And as she watched her daughter go through this, the pain of what happened came back in a very new and acute way, because she could actually, the language I use in the book is like, it's like a harrowing psychological hall of mirrors, that she could remember how her parents treated her when she was a teenager, look at her own teenager, realize she would never speak to her own teenager that way, developed a new sort of sadness for herself and a new empathy for herself and a new sense of pain around what had happened that was unavailable to her as a teenager, because as a teenager she only saw the teenage side of it. I think that happens all the time in families where people have teenagers and a lot comes back with a whole bunch more dimensions, and not all of them very comfortable.
Yeah, wow. And I'm even thinking as you're talking, I think this is true often, again, with both parents and with, I'm thinking of adults in a church setting where they, either there's kind of their own experience of remembering being a teenager, but I think also this, like, kind of doing the opposite of whatever they felt was wrong about how they were raised or how their youth pastor said something, or how, I mean, I don't know if that's just inevitable, that we're always kind of reacting to the perceived failures of the parent or responsible adult, or if there's a way to moderate that. I mean, is that just kind of, you need to do your own internal work as those things come up, or is there some way to not have it be, to not work out your own stuff maybe unfairly in the life of a teenager who doesn't have all of the background of the stuff that you're dealing with.
Right. Well, let's think about it this way. Let's say that there's correction and there's overcorrection.
Yeah.
And the story I tell in the book, this woman was on top of it, went and saw her therapist, like really was working hard to disentangle what was happening for her from what was happening for her kid, and ultimately cared for her kid really, really well through it, and ultimately found that to be a therapeutic experience for herself. And so I do think, and let's put that under the correction heading, right? Mm-hmm. That everybody's parents have limitations, and no one's more aware of them than their kids are, right? And so my parents have limitations, your parents have limitations. I don't even know your parents, but I know they have limitations.
Yeah.
As we come into parenting ourselves, we're aware of those limitations, and I think at best we think, okay, I can improve on this, or I can do better. And I think it does often happen that feels like a therapeutic, like almost corrective experience of like, I didn't repeat something that I didn't like, right? And that's fantastic and valuable and as good as it gets. What we want to watch out for is an overcorrection, like taking something too far in another new direction that may not be as processed as it should be, and may, have unintended consequences then that arise.
Yeah. You talk a lot about helping teenagers first express feelings before you get to the like manage, control, kind of regulate feelings. But the expressing part is really hard, both for the teenager, I'm sure, and I think for all people, there's times when it can be hard. But what kind of things can adults who have teenagers in their life do to create the right conditions for good conversations? And maybe what things should they not do? Are there things that could help better facilitate that for the sake of the teenager, not necessarily just because we think this is important, but because we know, as you've described, that it really does have an impact emotionally on them?
So what I try to bring across in this book, I devote 2 chapters to this, and there's only 5 chapters in the book, is that when it comes to regulating emotions, okay, so teenagers are going to have big, powerful negative feelings. Like, that's a done deal. When it comes to regulating them, we have 2 categories of resources. One is helping kids express emotions, which helps bring them down to size, and another is actually just actively taming them, just quieting emotions as a way to get relief. And I want to say out of the gate, like, these are equally important in the eyes of psychologists. Like, one is not better than the other. And the reason I say that is that we're very biased towards the first category. Often like the question I get, and this, you didn't ask it this way, is like, how do we get teenagers to talk about their feelings?
Yeah.
And it is important, but it's not the only game in town. And I just want to leave that there for now. Okay, but how do you get teenagers to talk about their feelings? So what I think is true is that teenagers often do try to initiate conversations about their feelings. And adults theoretically want this to happen, but adults then react in a way that makes a kid wish they hadn't said anything. So the most common, and I probably do this 10 times a day in my own home with my own teenagers, the most common version of this story is a kid comes forward with, sadness, distress, whatever's upsetting to them, and what they get is advice. They don't usually want advice, and they're not usually even asking or looking for advice. And it usually makes them feel like, forget it, never mind, I wish I hadn't said anything. So what I would say is, when teenagers express emotion, when they say, I'm anxious, I'm frustrated, I'm sad, the first thing an adult should do is just listen. Just really try to take it in. And then, when the adult feels they need to do or say something, to just offer empathy. To just say, I am so sorry. Man, that stinks, right? I wish that hadn't happened. That response is the kind of response that's going to make a teenager think, I'm going to come on back next time I have a feeling. Because you are not jumping to questions. You are not jumping to advice. You are not telling me what I should have done differently. So for me, it's like, that's usually where this falls apart. It's not anything more magical or elaborate than that. It's just how we respond when kids do share feelings gives them a sense of whether they want to keep doing that or not. So I would just start there.
Yeah, no, that's really helpful. I appreciate what you said at the beginning about, there is room for the managing emotions. And I even feel like outside of the conversation about teenagers, sometimes the message I have heard just for the emotional health of adults has been, to be your truest self, like just go with where the feelings are going. And having been a teenage girl and having had really struggled with big feelings, like it was immensely helpful for me to find strategies for regulating my emotions, for being able to like continue on in the world and not be completely sidetracked by it. And the same is true as an adult. So can you help us think about, especially when it comes to teenagers and how we talk to teenagers about feelings, but even for ourselves, how do we know what managing our emotions in a healthy way looks like versus kind of unhealthy managing of emotions, whether that's kind of like choosing to not feel them or kind of controlling them? You briefly talked about kind of controlling them in unhealthy ways. How could we either talk to teenagers about doing that well or notice for them like when it's healthy and when it's not?
So the two headings I want us to work with is first, having a varied repertoire. And second, good coping is coping that brings relief and does no harm. So what we're looking for is a wide range of emotional strategies or strategies for managing emotions. So let me just I'm going to run down like a whole bunch. So sometimes it's talking about feelings. Sometimes it is seeking comforts, right? Cuddling the dog, taking a bath, watching a favorite TV show that you know is going to make you laugh, which also falls under the category of distractions. A brief distraction can be really effective. Sometimes it's around problem solving, right? Trying to get to the bottom of the thing that caused the upset feelings. Sometimes it's around listening to music. A huge amount of how teenagers manage emotions is by finding music that matches the mood they are in, often a bad mood. They put on their sad playlist, they put on their angry playlist. This helps them, as they will say, get their feelings out. Fantastic. It may be that they want help with gaining perspective on something, right? That over time they think like, actually, it's not as big as I thought it was, and this is how I know, and that helps bring the feeling down to size. So there's just a huge array. Getting a good night's sleep is an effective coping strategy, right? And often fixes a whole lot of things. Yeah. So we want kids to use a varied repertoire. And what we want to stay away from are extremes. So one extreme we want to watch out for is when there's talking about feelings and talking about feelings and talking about feelings, and this is what you're describing, and it just sort of takes over. And what we call that is rumination. If the more you talk, the worse you feel, it's time to stop talking about the feeling. So we want to be careful. So expression works until it doesn't, but if it's turning into rumination, we want to look for another strategy, even temporarily. The other extreme would say be distraction, right? We don't want to have it be that every time a kid is upset, they hop on their video game, they use that to shut down all emotion. They're never expressing what they feel. We don't want that to be a constant strategy. So that's what I mean by having a broad repertoire. Yeah. But then the other heading here is it's good coping if it brings relief and does no harm. So I was just talking with a mom of a son, and we were talking about like sometimes kids get their feelings out in really quirky ways. She described her son dragging home a metal file cabinet that somebody left out on their lawn to be taken, and putting it in their backyard. And every time the kid was upset, if he was really angry, he'd go out and he'd kick it. And like, this is weird, right? And yet, if it brings relief and does no harm, let it be, right? So I think that's the thing we also have to do as adults is be open to the fact that coping is what works for the person who's doing it, even if it's not the thing that you would have chosen. And truly, sometimes teenagers come up with some pretty quirky stuff. But again, if no one's getting hurt, I'm all for it.
That actually sounds like, have you seen those businesses where you can go just like break things?
Awesome.
That sounds very similar, yeah.
I have a new appreciation for that, having written this book. I think, especially being a psychologist, I'm definitely biased towards verbal expression.
Sure.
and writing this book really helped me take much more seriously and much more honor, much more, that boys in particular, because our culture is so bad about teaching them how to talk about feelings, often blow off steam in physical ways.
Yeah. One last question for you, and this is something we're asking a host of experts when it comes to young people. When you think about young people today, like people who are teenagers now, young adults, what about that generation or that group of people gives you hope? What gives you hope about kind of where we're going collectively? What gives you hope about them, or what excites you about them? Sometimes it feels like these conversations can end up just feeling like it's so hard. Everything is difficult. But as you've described, you love teenagers and there are so many good things about them. So what gives you hope when you think about teenagers today?
They are so much more aware and so much faster in their processing of broad issues than any generation before them. This is the upside, I think, often of social media, is that they are plugged in to big issues in the world in a way that I certainly myself was quite naive about by comparison. And they also have used their often quite constant discourse on social media to develop the capacity to see shortcomings in arguments, make more sophisticated arguments. They're very quick to be aware of injustice and prejudice, and I don't know an adult who is not improved by listening to teenagers, especially around more progressive things. Teenagers, they lead the culture in terms of thinking in progressive and inclusive ways, and I am so grateful that I have 2 teenagers. I'm a vastly better person for it.
I love that. Thank you so much, Dr. Damour, for all of this. I really think it will be, as we've talked about, impactful for parents, but also for the whole host of adults that we want to be in young people's lives. So thank you.
Thank you for having me.
This episode is sponsored by 10 by 10. More than 1 million young people in the U.S. are walking away from the church every year, but it doesn't have to be this way. 10 by 10 is a diverse group of Christ followers from different cultures, ethnicities, and traditions. 100 organizations working together to address this concerning trend. 10 by 10 has 4 priorities: to make youth discipleship a top focus for U.S. ministry leaders, to elevate leaders of color and their organizations and networks to reflect the diversity of the body of Christ in the world today, to curate, create, and share resources and training to equip local leaders to reach the next generation, and to connect and mobilize partner organizations to collectively impact 100,000 diverse faith communities nationwide. Learn more about 10 by 10 by going to the website 10by10.org. That's TENX10.org. TENX10.org to empower you to help faith matter more to the next generation. And thanks to 10 by 10 for sponsoring this episode.
All right, I am here with Skye, who you know, and Kara Powell, who's the executive director of the Fuller Youth Institute and one of the leaders of 10 by 10. And we are going to talk today about the Lisa Damour interview that I did recently. To start us out, because I got to actually talk with her, so I got to think about all the things I think are interesting. Kara and Skye, just tell me what about that interview and maybe more generally Lisa Damour's work really has been interesting to you or helpful to you, what in that struck you. Or Kara, you mentioned earlier there might even be something broader in Lisa's work that has been impactful for you. I'd love to hear that too.
Yeah, well, there was so much that I appreciated about Lisa's comments, especially, and I see this in young people, how if they have a history of navigating anxiety, they're anxious about their anxiety. They're fearful about their fear. And so it just becomes exacerbated instead of being more tolerant of some of those negative emotions. When we are so fearful about them, it just escalates the anxiety. But really, one of my favorite insights from Lisa, I've never met her, Kaitlyn. I'm so envious of you that you have. But one of my favorite insights just from reading her work is she talks about being a wall for young people. And let me just say, especially as a parent of teenagers and young adults, like this is one of my mantras. And what she says is that we need to be, as adults, this as much as we can, be unconditional support and acceptance for young people. Like a wall. And I grew up swimming, so I think about a swimming pool when I think about this. And that young people, my kids, your kids, other young people that we know, as they're appropriately individuating, they're going to kick against us. They're going to move away from us. And sometimes that leaves us as a wall feeling dented, feeling cracked, feeling beat up. And our young person's kind of treading water, trying to navigate things on their own. And we struggle with feeling maybe rejected. And there's all sorts of ways as adults that we might be tempted to distance ourselves from young people at that point, to protect ourselves, to start putting up boundaries ourselves. And what Lisa wisely says is eventually that young person is going to want to swim back to you. And have you been a wall that hasn't moved, or because of our own fear, our own anxiety, our own feelings of abandonment, if we've withdrawn too much, then it's harder for them to swim back to us. And so, especially with our 3 kids, when they are, again, appropriately moving away from me, and yet it still hurts as a parent. And I'm tempted to shut down, to distance myself. I mean, I have so many times said, be a wall, Kara, be a wall. You know, especially on family vacations. I don't know what it is about family vacations. I love them. And they also turn up the heat on some of these issues, right? We're with each other for 7 days, 10 days. And so our last family vacation a month ago, something happened and I was tempted to withdraw. And I was repeating Lisa's mantra, be a wall, be a wall, be a wall. So that's just one of my favorite insights from her.
I'm glad you brought that up. Yeah, I obviously she didn't share that directly on the interview, but that is so, it resonates with my experience as a parent and my failures,
Yes,
honestly.
Totally.
2 things jumped out to me from the interview that I really appreciated. One was, Kaitlyn, you asked her whether teenagers today or young people have it harder than in the past. And I love the fact that she said, there's some things that are different, like all the social media and the pandemic and things, but she normalized being a teenager has just always been hard. It always will be hard. Yeah. And I wonder if, she didn't put it this way, but have we over pathologized the ordinary struggles of being a young adult in this generation? Kaitlyn, you shared honestly about some of your experiences as a teenager and looking back on it. Anybody listening to this interview, no doubt, recalled some of those experiences. And nobody pathologized my struggles as a teenager. It was just, you're a teenager. Yeah. This is what you do. And I wonder if we've over pathologized ordinary challenges for our teenagers. Now, there are clearly teenagers who are in deep psychological despair and mental health challenges, and that needs to be diagnosed and dealt with appropriately. But man, sometimes it's just hard being a teenager. Yeah. And we, as a parent, I feel the temptation to go, oh, do you need medication? Do you need intervention? Do you need, and you get fearful that, well, what if I miss the signs that something pathological is going on that needs intervention, rather than just to be the wall or to be empathetic or to be a good listener. So that was one. And then the other one kind of related to that was, she specifically talked about the gender stereotyping in our society around girls being allowed to have a wide range of emotions and boys aren't. And the need for men in their lives, fathers in particular, to model healthy emotional vulnerability. And thinking back to I have one son and 2 daughters. I was thinking back to how have I done that well and when did I fail to do that well? But then more broadly, I just feel like, especially in church contexts, it's really hard to find emotionally healthy men in churches. We just don't model that. We don't teach that. And unfortunately, a lot of the so-called men's ministry stuff that goes on out there, not all of it, but a lot of it reinforces those negative stereotypes of stoicism and, hardness. And even in the last year, my son is 18, he just left for college. I think I probably showed more emotional vulnerability with him than I had in the past. And I'm not sure he always knew what to do with that. I didn't always know what to do with that. Yeah. But to show what it looks like to have conflict and resolve it healthy, to be sad and deal with it well, to be angry without being destructive. It's hard as just a person to do that, but especially as a father with boys, it's really weird and hard, and not seeing that very much. And frankly, a lot of just the men in our community, Christian or non-Christian, I know, express sideways their emotions, whether it's through drinking or work or activity or sport or competition or whatever, but it's rarely direct and healthy. Yeah. So, man, that's a tough call. I don't know how to do that when it's just not modeled.
Yeah, that was actually I'm glad you said that, Skye. One of the things I wanted to ask y'all about was, Lisa Damour does not specifically focus on church contexts. And when she was talking both about this gender dynamic, and then I thought at the beginning of the interview, I was asking her about one of the things that struck me in her book so much, which was her kind of criticism of a form of like wellness culture that can tell us that any what we would consider negative emotions are bad and need to be kind of squashed. And I love the example she gave of like a kid moving their senior year of high school, which I did. And it's like, no, that's just awful. That's an emotionally healthy response to be upset about that. And I didn't ask her this, but I'm asking you all, like, what can we do in the church, whether it is, as Sky, you just described, specifically kind of a gendered problem, but even more generally, I think a lot of, especially youth leaders, like I'm thinking about my church, the adults who volunteer in the youth group, not only have been shaped and formed by these kinds of cultural messages that say, oh, those emotions are not good, but also understandably feel uncomfortable dealing with them. Like when teenagers have big emotions, it feels really scary to engage, especially because you're not in the same kind of brain space they're in terms of how big feelings can be. And so do either of you have any kind of practical thoughts about how we as the church, especially for young people, but maybe just more broadly, create the conditions under which we have a healthier understanding of difficult emotions and also just maybe like emotions in general and expressing emotions well?
Yeah. So I was a youth group kid in the 80s, and I think if I was to describe my experience in the youth group, which did so many wonderful things for me, but the way I kind of walked away is there's a song from the 80s or 90s, "Don't Worry, Be Happy." And I think that was kind of what I thought.
UB40, that was great.
Okay, there we go, nice. And I think that's what I thought it meant to follow Jesus, is don't worry, be happy. And I've since realized, and one of the things that we talk with youth leaders and families about all the time, is just the power of lament, the power of acknowledging the pain that we're experiencing, whether it's families talking over dinner about, highs and lows, things to be grateful for and things that they're grieving, whether it's youth ministries taking time in the Psalms of lament, giving young people the chance to really share the pain that they're navigating. I think there's so much that the church, especially evangelical churches, can learn from lament as a biblical and timeless practice. So honestly, that's the first recommendation that comes to mind for me, Kaitlyn.
Don't Worry, Be Happy was Bobby McFerrin. I think there was a cover of it done by UB40.
See, you said UB40, and I didn't want to correct you because, it's decades old. But yeah, I thought it was Bobby McFerrin also.
It is Bobby McFerrin.
Okay.
It is totally Bobby McFerrin.
Okay.
But I could be wrong. Maybe there's a UB40 cover of it. Yeah, lament. Amen. But I mean, building beyond that, maybe this is just on my mind because I've been doing a series in my devotional on the Psalms. But in my church experience as a teenager, I was never, the feelings that are expressed in the Bible weren't validated to me. Like,
yeah.
And I came from a tradition and even got this reinforced in seminary that church is always supposed to be celebratory all the time, because it wasn't a liturgical church that kind of had different seasons and it was always just celebration all the time. And when you actually read the Psalms, you discover, gosh, more of them are either lament or complaint than they are celebration or joy. And I think we need to help young people recognize that, I think it's Jonathan Haidt who talks about our feelings are not an accurate depiction of reality. Like we can't trust our feelings to tell us true things about the world, but we do need to learn to trust our feelings to tell us true things about ourselves. So you might be sad or angry or anxious or whatever, and that may not map onto what's actually going on in the world, but we do need to be honest about that and express it and recognize that gives us the raw materials to build our communion with God. And I think that's what you see in the Psalms. People expressing themselves honestly to God, even when those honest expressions are actually saying something that's untrue about God. For example, you often hear the psalmist say, "Where are you, Lord?" Are we to take that to mean that God's not present? Of course not. We're to take that as the psalmist expressing the way they feel God's absence. And that validates those feelings. But again, in the churches that I've been a part of, that's rarely ever validated. So for a parent or a youth worker or a pastor to say, your anxiety or your sadness or your fear is real and legitimate, and you should use that and express it to God, while at the same time reaffirming God is with you. He does love you. He is going to walk with you through this. That brings the truth of God and the truth of our emotions together and man, I wish I had learned that when I was a teenager, because it took me decades to get there.
I'm still learning it, Sky. So
Yeah,
you're ahead
same.
of me if you think you got it.
Yes, I was just in my Bible study last night. We were reading from I think it's Psalm like 43 and 44, 42 and 43 that talk about, why are you downcast, O my soul? Put your hope in God. And I was thinking about that in the context of this conversation, thinking I've read that verse as if, well, why would you be downcast? Put your faith in God, instead of like, no, actually, maybe this is a genuine question of like interrogating why and then putting that in a larger perspective. And it says in that same psalm, like, remember who God is. And it reminded me of when Dr. Damour was talking about like the brain chemistry development of teenagers, which reading her book, I thought that was so interesting. And I told her kind of emotional for me, because I was like, wow, I remember that experience of feeling out of control with your emotions. And one of the things that she talked about is that like the part of your brain that can give you perspective on things, like, yes, I am downcast, but all this other stuff is good, or God is good, and I can have hope in that, kind of fades away. You don't have that ability to kind of gain perspective, even on a small scale of like, this one homework you missed isn't the end of your life, is harder to grasp. What would you all say for, important adults in kids' lives, especially their parents, knowing this fact about like where their brains are developed and how it's happening? What are ways to respond to that kind of difficulty, that realization that there are big emotions, that there's difficulty putting perspective or making wise decisions in a way that isn't the kind of like version that I have often heard, like this psalm verse being kind of like crocheted on a pillow of like, oh, put your hope in God, that isn't cliched or kind of like a platitude for a teenager who's like, no, you might not think that this is a big deal, but my experience of this thing is very serious. You telling me that doesn't fix the problem. But how could we help kind of still understand that some perspective might need to be given?
Well, at the Full Youth Institute, we've actually done quite a bit of research on mental health and surveyed other people's research, including Lisa Damour's. And we have an A, B, C, D, E on how to respond to young people. But based on your question, Kaitlyn, I'm going to just say E, and if we have time to get through A to D, great. And the E is empower through empathy. So it's actually two E's, and I think both are really important. And again, I'll quote Lisa Damour, as I do all the time when I talk about this. She has this great phrase where it's, that stinks, but I think you can handle it. And so there's two parts. There's the that stinks. Gosh, if I had that many tests, I'd be stressed too. Man, I'd be feeling lonely if all my friends were doing something and I wasn't a part. So there's this acknowledgement of the pain, the anger, the sadness, the anxiety. But then that's paired somehow with something that's empowering, which might be, I think you can probably handle it. Or it might be, how can I support you in this season? Or it might be, what options do you think you might have? What do you think you can do, etc. So just this fundamental empathize and also empower. Because I think as adults, mentors, parents, we're usually good at one or the other. We're usually really good at empathy and we just kind of sit there with young people, or we're terrible at empathy and it feels like we're just giving platitudes to them, especially before they're ready for it. So to me, that phrase just holds a lot of power.
That's great.
What comes to my mind is what you already said, Kara, is the be the wall.
Yeah.
Is that the quote?
Yeah, be a wall, but yes.
Be a wall, yeah. I'm thinking about moments where my kids at different ages just had emotional meltdowns that were obviously irrational, but just an overwhelm. And it's really hard, but to be a non-reactive presence, right? Mm-hmm. Because sometimes they're having a meltdown and it gets directed to you. Yeah. You, the parent, are the problem, or you, the adult, are the problem in this case. And it takes so much strength to not react personally, get triggered by it. But I know she was talking about teenagers, but I think this applies just as much to parents and adults and youth workers. When she was talking about good coping practices, I think the formula she gave was, good coping is something that brings relief that doesn't cause harm. Those of us who are helping young adults and teenagers need to figure out how to cope with their emotions as well, right? And to do that in a way which brings relief but doesn't cause harm either to them or to us. So, and that gets really tricky. It takes a lot of wisdom. Like, she talked about video games. There have been days where, like my son, who is more into video games than my daughters, I would actually tell him, go play a video game. Like, you need to decompress, go play a video game. Now, if he did that chronically, that would cause harm. But once in a while, it's okay. And same thing with me and my wife. Like, there are days where our teenagers, we're just at our rope's end. And we need some way to decompress and cope. But you have to figure out, what does that look like? When does it go from being a good coping thing to a harmful one? And even in what we prescribe or try to do for our kids, empathize and empower, like you said, Kara, but man, you can over empathize to the point where it becomes harmful, and you can over empower where you just say, and so it's so much wisdom needed here, and knowing each kid needs something different. And this is where you can't just rely on formulas. It takes a lot of wisdom to study a particular kid and how they're wired and what they need at that moment, and what might be good coping for one actually ends up harming another. And that's why I don't give parenting advice very much.
Yeah. We just have a few more minutes. Kara, do you want to give us the other ABCDs? I love the E, but I'd love to hear the other ones too.
Yeah. And a lot of this is grounded from what we gleaned from mental health professionals. The first is to ask, that's the A, and this specific question: on a scale of 1 to 10, how anxious or stressed are you right now, or depressed, whatever the emotion is. And, if it's a 1, 2, 3, that's no big deal. If it's a 4 or 5, that's probably okay. 6 or above is where you want to start thinking about bringing in some professional support. And sometimes young people can't even articulate that themselves. So you might say, gosh, on a scale of 1 to 10, it seems like you're maybe about a 7. But I use this with my own kids just as a way to check in and see if what I'm seeing really reflects what they're feeling. The second B is to breathe. And there are so many great breath exercises, and especially when young people are anxious or panicking or even in a panic attack, that normally manifests as trouble breathing. And so with young people, how do we, you can Google breath exercises. How do you, ahead of time, not in the moment of the stress, but ahead of time, how do you even practice with them? So that's the B. The C is to center on a helpful truth or phrase. Because, as much as we want to empathize, et cetera, I do want young people to grab on to the truths of Scripture and the truth about Jesus. And so actually with one of our kids who struggles with anxiety, if this child is struggling, I'm trying to not reveal gender here. What I tend to say to them is, okay, let's identify a couple truths, and one that starts with Jesus or God. And so what our child will say is generally, even if X happens, I'm safe. And then usually Jesus is with me or something like that. And so how do we help young people hold on to a lyric from a worship song, something from Scripture, something from a poem, whatever it might be? And then D, and I'll tell you, I've thought this multiple times during this conversation, develop a team. Develop a team. Parenting is not a solo sport. And I think back to Skye's earliest comment, sometimes why we pathologize is because we're only seeing one slice of the young person. So if you're a youth pastor or a church leader, talk to parents. If you're a parent, talk to teachers, etc. Create a team and help the young person create a team. If they struggle in physics class, if they struggle in soccer practice, if they struggle in church activities, help them talk to an adult, maybe even peers, who know what's going on and will be extra sensitive. So D is develop a team.
That's great.
Kaitlyn, that came up in your interview where you talked about the role of other adults in the church in caring. And oh my gosh, I'm so indebted to our team, right? To other adults, youth workers. There's been young life workers that have had a significant role in those relationships as the kids get to be middle school, high school age are just so critical because mom and dad are idiots and you need other adults in their lives to be able to speak these things. So it's a huge part of this.
Yeah. Often we actually are being idiots, or our kids sort of think we're idiots. Either way.
Right.
Either it's reality or their perceptions. Either way, we need other adults.
Yeah.
So if someone's listening to this and you're not a parent and you think, you have a huge role in the lives of these young people in our community, for sure.
Yeah. And I love what you just said, Kara, about talking amongst the adults, because I think there's been an understandable backlash against the mentality in the church of, oh, just drop your kids off at youth group. Someone else's job is, it's someone else's job to spiritually form them. I'm at a church where I'm like, well, no, when there's a crying teenager in the lobby and I happen to be the adult that's there, it's not because someone said, oh, take this child off my hands and deal with it. It's because I know your parents and I've been at dinner with you and we're like on the same team towards your health and flourishing. Yeah. And that's a very different thing than just kind of outsource the spiritual formation of your children to other adults. That's, really be the family of God amongst a lot of people coming from different nuclear families. So I love that even in her research, which, is not specifically in a church setting, she was saying like, no, you need a bunch of people. Yeah. So thank you both for that. Thank you for listening to the interview and for giving us some practical tips, which we had a little bit of the interview, but I think it's helpful to give people some ideas of how they can really respond to what can be a challenging conversation with a teenager in their life.
Thanks, Kaitlyn.
You bet. Fun conversation.
The Holy Post podcast is a production of Holy Post Media. Production assistance by Mike Strelo. Editing by Area Code Audio. Help us create more thoughtful Christian media by subscribing to Holy Post Plus at holypost.com/plus. Also, be sure to leave a review on Apple Podcasts so more people can discover thoughtful Christian commentary, plus ukulele and occasional butt news. Visit holypost.com for show notes, news stories, Holy Post merchandise, and much more.